Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the great pleasure to be discussing biogeochemical cycling. So, biogeochemical cycling is at the very heart of the study of ecosystem ecology, and what what I mean by that is the fact that it's all about the interaction between biotic and abiotic. When we're talking about nutrients cycling through the ecosystem, we're talking about crucial elements like nitrogen and carbon and phosphorus. And just the details of that are so interesting and so important. And so that's what this video is all about. And so it's going to look at some of these crucial cycles. But one of the most crucial cycles, interestingly enough, is not necessarily a biogeochemical cycle in and of itself. It's simply the water cycle. And again, probably most of you are familiar with the water cycle somewhere from your past. And so it has to do more with physical phenomena than it does with biological. And so let's talk about it. I put a picture here of one of the great waterfalls in Yosemite National Park, which is called Wapama Falls. And this enters into Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. And so as it turns out that this water that comes down from the side of the cliff is liquid water. And as it turns out, this may be obvious, but liquid water is the state of water that I think is most usable when it comes to biology. What are the other states? Well, you can have steam, you could have vapor, you could have frozen water, which is ice, and those are not necessarily accessible to biological organisms. And so let's talk about this water cycle a little bit. Due to the heat of the sun, radiation comes down, and that infrared causes the temperature to increase in the water, and warmer water molecules will evaporate and travel up into the sky. Now, this is a marine environment, so the solute of salt remains behind. So this is fresh water that's evaporating, and then it condenses into clouds. And oftentimes those clouds will, through the source of fog and wind, will come across and it will condense. And then ultimately, weather conditions will cause, cooler weather conditions can cause precipitation. In other words, the rain will come down. And if it's raining on the land, this is fresh water. And so it's either going to run off the side of the mountain or it's going to collect in these reservoirs that we like to call these sink basins called lakes. And so if it's up at a higher altitude, it could even snow. And so you get some snow up here. And then when the snow melts, you have runoff through streams. Now, some of that water on the land can actually penetrate the soil. Sort of, I like to think about that as sort of like a coffee maker when the water's raining down and it's going through the coffee grounds. It's called percolation, and so this is the source of groundwater as well. And so all that water, fresh water, can run down streams and rivers and then ultimately transport itself back into the ocean. And so this little notion over here, transpiration, let me animate it to make it a little bit larger. You might be familiar with this, the fact that, for example, I'll just draw one leaf. When water travels into the roots of a plant, it's pulled up through the ideas of cohesion and adhesion. And so this is a negative pressure which causes the water to move up a plant and then ultimately evaporate from the leaf. And this is what causes water to be able to move up a tree. It's called transpiration. And so basically it's the evaporation of water through plants. And the reason I bring that up, it's fairly significant. So the water is being transpired, and that's part of the hydrologic cycle as well, or water cycle. And so here's another diagram of this. And so here's the water evaporating and condensing into clouds, and then here it is precipitating. And so the water can travel in a river. Again, rivers are one directional. It could actually percolate into the water and be stored in the form of groundwater, or it could be trapped in lakes. And as the rivers meander down, usually the slopes in one direction, it can even fan out into regions called the delta, where the water is meeting the ocean. And sometimes you could even have a mixture of fresh water and ocean water, which we like to call an estuary. Okay, so the water cycle is kind of a physical phenomenon. It has to do with evaporation and condensation, precipitation, and it's quite important to us because, again, all life requires water. And so I just wanted to point out an area I was mentioning, Wapama Falls in Yosemite, which is right here. This is the great river in California that bisects Yosemite National Park. It's called the Tuolumne River. And this is the Hetch Hetchy Valley. And what's interesting is this Hetch Hetchy Valley no longer looks like this. Hetch Hetchy means grassy, grassy. And it was once thought by John Muir to be almost as beautiful or as beautiful as the Great Yosemite Valley. But unfortunately, it was decided that a dam needed to be put right here and block the Tuolumne River, and it's called O'Shaughnessy Dam. And you can see below that the dam was built, it was finished in around 1923, I believe. And what you see is this big body of water, and we use this water now in the Bay Area for drinking water. And so it's rather critical. And so maybe someday, though, we will eliminate the dam and we'll let the valley restore itself back to its normal condition. And it's like, well, what are we going to do with the water? Perhaps someday in the future we'll be able to drink the marine water and be able to remove the salt from that water inexpensively so that it's more economically feasible. So that's our hope for the future. Here's a picture of O'Shaughnessy Dam, and this is the fresh water that's located here in Hetch Hetchy in Yosemite, which is the main drinking water for San Francisco, as I mentioned. And also, the city uses a lot of this water pressure for hydroelectric power, which is a great source of energy, which is not a lot of pollution is created. So that's another pro point of the dam. So let's talk about the very first great example of the biogeochemical cycle, and that is of carbon. Now, the element carbon cycles, like all elements. There's a finite amount of it on the planet of the Earth, and basically it's in the air, and it's in living organisms, and it's in the soil, and it's in the water, and it basically cycles around and around. And so if you're going to discuss a cycle, where do you start? And so I could start, for example, in the air. And so carbon dioxide is a gas, and it's found in the air, CO2. It's not the only carbon-containing gas. There's other gases that have carbon, like, for example, methane gas, CH4, and there's carbon monoxide, CO. But let's talk about CO2. CO2 is taken in by plants on the land, but it's also taken in by algae in the water. It's also taken in by phytoplankton in the ocean. And so when it's taken in through the biotic process of photosynthesis, it's converted into carbohydrates. And so let me start to illustrate some of this so it's a little bit easier to follow. So that carbon dioxide is then stored in the form of a carbohydrate in either the leaf material or in the trunk of a tree. And so it's stored there. So it's a little bit of a reservoir. And so you can see in the diagram, so it's plant or algae or even cyanobacteria, which is a word, blue-green bacteria, they can also photosynthesize. So carbohydrates are produced as a result of photosynthesis. So there's the carbon. Now, tangent to the cycle is the fact that that's not going to happen unless, I don't want you to be confused, but I'm going to bring it up anyway. Photosynthesis isn't going to happen without the input of water. And also, as a byproduct, you might be familiar with the fact that oxygen is also produced in photosynthesis in primary production. But I want to hang out with the carbohydrate because it's the carbohydrate that is then being picked up by the primary consumer. So in this case, it's a bunny, but it could be us if we're eating a carrot, or if we're eating some lettuce, or if we're eating a peach or some cherries. Any sort of herbivore is taking in the carbohydrate. And so that carbohydrate, or that carbon, this is what we're focusing on, the carbon is going into the herbivore and it's being burned. When I say burned, I mean respiration. So cell respiration. So oxygen is reacting with the sugar, and as a consequence of respiration, hope this isn't too confusing. So respiration, it's the burning of sugar with oxygen, is then going to release carbon dioxide back in the atmosphere. It's the gas that we're breathing out. So that's carbon dioxide. So I'm burning the sugars that are inside of me that I ate earlier in the day. So that's cell respiration. Now, hopefully I don't take myself out of this equation, because this is part of the trophic level. So nice little bunny might get eaten by a higher level consumer. So in other words, this cat's going to come along and consume it. So the organic, when I say organic compounds, now it could mean sugar. In other words, the bunny does have sugar in it, but it could also mean organic compounds in the form of proteins or fats, like lipids or sugars. So these are all carbon containing. And it's like, well, where did the bunny get all these things? Again, it makes some of them on its own, but it gets the carbon from eating the plant material. And then that gets moved on to the next trophic level. So if you're a carnivore, you're getting your carbon from eating a rabbit. And now that is also burning the sugar in form of cell respiration, which is putting carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Okay, so watch this. So let's say that, okay, and then how come we're including a plant here? Because sometimes it's often forgotten that plants also respire. The reason that they produce the sugar and oxygen is so that they can use it themselves for energy. So plants are also putting off carbon dioxide. So everybody's putting off carbon dioxide. And so watch this. Sorry for being so morbid about this. So when the tree dies and the cat dies and the mouse dies, the rabbit dies, everything dies, you get detrivores, which are organisms that are eating dead organic material. Now let's look at the decomposers of this, which are the bacteria and fungi. They're going to be breaking down those organisms, the detritus, breaking down the dead material and breaking it down into simple elements, and it's the bacteria are going to be consuming those organic molecules for energy, and they're also breathing out carbon dioxide. So the microorganisms, so how about this? Carbon dioxide's rising out of the soil because bacteria are producing that. Plants are producing carbon dioxide. We're producing carbon dioxide. Cows are producing carbon dioxide. And so, how do you like this? Many, many, many millions of years ago, when the earth was covered by huge amounts of coniferous forest, those trees that passed away, here's a physical process, were built up by pressure and pushed down and sediments building up all down here like this. And then ultimately, what we get in the bottom of down in here, we have something called coal and we have oil. Now, that was a poor description of the formation of coal and oil. Sorry about that. Take me on faith on this. If you want to look it up, it's fine. The forests are broken down into coal and oil, which are these massive reservoirs of carbon molecules. So these are hydrocarbons, lots of carbon here. Where did the carbon come from? Photosynthesis. And so what we have done, humanity, let's put us over here, we take these carbon compounds, the oil and the coal, and even wood, and we burn it. Again, it's the same reaction as cell respiration. We're burning these in factories to produce heat and energy. And it can power our cars and warm our homes. You know this. But as a result, carbon dioxide is produced. And you're like, wow, there's a lot of carbon dioxide being produced. Yeah, because combustion reactions, in other words, burning fuels, produces carbon dioxide. But then, all things being said, you might get worried, but actually the level of carbon dioxide is really just a little under 1% of what air is, carbon dioxide. So here's a brief look at the carbon cycle. Hopefully that wasn't too busy. Now, when I was mentioning carbohydrate, I was saying, H2O, carbohydrate. But here's a picture of what glucose, this is a simple sugar monosaccharide, what it looks like. Here's a carbon, there's a carbon, there's a carbon, carbon, and carbon, and carbon. If you count them up, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So if there's 6 carbons, you see this? You can predict how many, twice as many. So you'd be like, 12. And then how many oxygens? Bup, 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 bup. I don't even have to count them. There's 6. See how it's the ratio of 1 to 2 to 1? 1 to 2 to 1. So this is what we're talking about in terms of carbon dioxide is stored in the form of sugar. Thought you might appreciate that. And so factories are producing carbon dioxide. Animals are producing carbon dioxide. How about this? Here's a little trivia. What organisms, what animals are producing the most carbon dioxide? You're like, You might say, well, it could be the largest animals, but then you'd have to consider which are the most numerous animals. Notice I mentioned animals because if I said what organism is producing the most carbon dioxide, you would easily answer that and say that bacteria are producing the most carbon dioxide. But if I say what animal, say what's the most numerous animal that's doing this, that's eating a lot of wood and producing a lot of carbon dioxide, that would be termites. So termites make a tremendous amount of carbon dioxide, and actually so do cows as well, and horses and stuff. So what happens is, here's the oil and the coal that can be burned into carbon dioxide. Remember, photosynthesis is what's making the sugar. In other words, glucose, right here. Carbon dioxide is making glucose. And then, how about this? That carbon dioxide goes into the water, and there's also great levels of primary productivity in the water as well. Algae are producing glucose. And that's important because all the consumers in the water need that primary productivity in order to survive. They're the ones eating. And so the carbon cycles happen in the water as well. What's interesting is about this little tangent is that carbon dioxide, when it dissolves into water, as it turns out, you might be familiar with the fact that carbon dioxide really dissolves easily into water. And that's what we like, carbon dioxide in our water. It's what makes soda. And then we can add some sugar to that, and it's carbonated water. And so when carbon dioxide reacts with water, it forms this product called bicarbonate. And this is actually how a lot of it is stored in water in this particular structure, bicarbonate ion. And so just a little something there. And again, just to tie it up on the carbon cycle, is that, some of the things is that, plants respire producing carbon dioxide, animals respire, and then plants take this up, and again, factories produce carbon dioxide as well. A concern is that sometimes when there's lots of fires going on, in addition to just the burning of carbon-containing molecules, when there's a lot of fire going on, that also increases the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so we have to be careful about that as well. Just want to point that out. So now let's draw our attention to the nitrogen cycle. Now the nitrogen cycle is so very important, and let me explain why that is the case. Because nitrogen, you may not be able to appreciate it if you're just beginning studying biology, but I'll just say this, that nitrogen is found in very, very important molecules such as protein. And so proteins, in order to make a protein, you need nitrogen. And then let me throw this out. You might have heard of this, deoxyribonucleic acid and ribonucleic acid. These are important compounds, biological molecules that need nitrogen in order to be produced. And so I can ask you this, so where do we get our nitrogen? And well, again, we get our carbon from eating both animals and plants, and we get our nitrogen from both eating plants and animals. So we get it from eating. But ultimately, it comes down to plants. It comes down to where are plants getting nitrogen. And so this is why the picture of this grass here in the soil, because it talks the metabolism. In other words, the chemical reactions of bacteria and plants are really going to be what makes nitrogen available to us if you want to make it human-centric. And so what's ironic, the beginning of the nitrogen cycle discussion, what's ironic is that in the atmosphere, remember I was saying that carbon dioxide is less than 1%? You ready for this? Atmospheric nitrogen is 80%. So in other words, out of a container of air, a simple container of air, 80% of air is nitrogen gas. And nitrogen gas is the molecular formula is N2. Let me sort of do that. It's N2, which looks like this. Triple covalent bond. So 80% of air is nitrogen gas. And so you might be thinking, wow, all plants have to do is breathe it in and they're good. They'll be able to have nitrogen and be able to produce their proteins. Now, unfortunately, plants cannot assimilate, in other words, transfer nitrogen gas into usable compounds. So they breathe it in, they breathe it out. And so what's going to happen? As it turns out, that bacteria are really, really, really important here. And so the nitrogen gas travels into the soil like this, travels into the soil. Now it's not going to travel into the soil if you put concrete here. That's going to be impenetrable. But let's say it's outside. And so the nitrogen gas is going into the soil. And as it turns out, there's lots of different kinds of bacteria, and we're about to talk about them. There's all kinds of bacteria. I'll just make it really large so you can see it, but really they're invisible because they're microscopic. But there's bacteria that will take this nitrogen gas and they'll convert it into another chemical called ammonium, which is NH4+, and it's an ion because it has an electrical charge. So they're able to take nitrogen gas and turn it into ammonium. You're like, well, why is that important? Well, it's because the ammonium, if you look down in this diagram, the ammonium is something that can diffuse into the roots of the grass, and the plant can then take the ammonium, the NH4+, break that apart and use the nitrogen to produce protein. First, it creates amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, but ultimately they produce protein. And then we can come along and eat the plant and get the protein. That's how we get protein, from eating plants or eating an animal that has eaten a plant. And so how does the plant make the protein? It first has to absorb ammonium in the soil. And who's going to do that? Who's going to produce ammonium? Well, I was mentioning this, that there's a type of bacteria in the soil that's capable of breathing in nitrogen gas. It's called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Now, I know that this might be a little overwhelming to you because it's like I'm going to come strong with different kinds of bacteria here, and I'm going to name them four different things. And so it's like, oh, good, But again, it's something that is so critical, and I don't want to say that for everything, but this is extremely critical, and so it's worthwhile for us to pay attention to it. But just like anything, just to pause for a second. If you're just meeting people for the first time and people are introducing themselves to you, they're like, hey, my name's this, sometimes it's fleeting and you forget their name. And that's kind of common. But the more you spend time with them, the more you get to know with them and you start to develop a relationship, the names become really important and you get to know them, and it's like almost impossible to think of them other than their name. And so I just want to point that out. These are called nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They can take nitrogen gas from the air and turn it into ammonium. But I want to first, before I go into nitrogen fixing, I want to talk about another class of bacteria that's in the soil. This is underground in the soil, close up. Ammonifying bacteria. Now, ammonifying bacteria are basically bacteria that will take dead organisms, in other words, detritus, so a dead plant, orange peels, banana peels, corn husks, a dead rabbit or dead ants or leaves or anything detritus, any organic material, like for example in your compost pile at your house in the backyard, any organic material, you're going to get bacteria called ammonifying bacteria, shown here in yellow. They're not really yellow, but ammonifying bacteria will break down those nitrogen compounds such as amino acids, and they'll break that down into ammonium. And what that does is it sort of like, if you will, makes it smaller. That's a simplification. Makes it smaller in your compost pile, because compost, the goal of compost is to make good soil. So your compost pile, after a while is going to have a lot of ammonium in it. Can you appreciate that? For once was like food scraps, it's now ammonium. And you're like, gee, the soil's really good. Why is the soil really good? Because it has a lot of ammonium in it. And what is the ammonium going to do? Well, when you take that soil and you put it in your garden where you're growing roses, for example, or you're growing a vegetable garden like zucchini, that ammonium is then going to be taken in by the plant, and it's going to be able to produce its own protein, amino acids, and it's going to thrive. So that's what we mean by good soil. Good soil has ammonium in it. Okay, and so what's interesting is in nature, nature composts on its own. It doesn't need humanity to think that it's helping out. And so when a tree falls, it's going to get broken down. But one of the things is bacteria sometimes, interestingly enough, have a hard time breaking down the proteins or what have you in a tree because the cell wall is so difficult. And so oftentimes you need the help of fungi. So there's mushroom and other fungus produce these really interesting enzymes that will break down cell walls. And so fungi break down the cell walls, and then that makes it accessible to bacteria, the ammonifying bacteria, that will turn the organic compounds that have nitrogen in it into ammonium. So these ammonifying bacteria, this is a actual picture of them. They sort of look like little cotton balls. They're circular, called cocci bacteria. Kind of a weird name. So here's your compost pile. And so what's happening, let me illustrate this. What's happening in your compost pile is that organic material, which is like the leaves, so all this leaf material, okay, what's inside of the leaf material? The leaf material has things like amino acids in it. And now if I were to draw a bunch of amino acids, I might make it like this into a chain. And a chain of amino acids makes a protein. But if I were to draw one simple amino acid, I'm going to do that for you. I'm going to say that an amino acid looks a little bit like this. So don't get overwhelmed. So here's an amino acid. Okay? And so this bacteria right there is able to take in the plant, which is the organic material, the plant amino acid, and sort of just rip it apart like this. Let me get this. So it rips off this group, this carboxylic acid group, and it rips off the R group, and then it rips this ammonium off, and it turns it this amino group, and it turns it into ammonium. And so what it does is it's producing ammonium right there. And so now that is prevalent in the soil, in the bottom of the compost pile. This is our goal, is to make a lot of this. Why do I need a lot of this? Because plants, when you feed that soil to your garden, it's going to appreciate all of that ammonium ion. Okay? Now, here's something, and maybe this will be disappointing, but there's another step in this process. I think it makes it even more interesting. It's all about your attitude. As it turns out, grass in your garden, can take ammonium, but it actually prefers to take nitrogen in the form of nitrate. And so there's another kind of bacteria in the soil called nitrifying. The name sort of says what it does. It takes the ammonium ion and it converts it instead of NH4 plus, it turns it into NO, which is oxygen 3 minus. And plants love that nitrate. And it can also turn it into NO2, nitrite. And so check this out. Nitrates and nitrites are over here in the soil, and plants really take that in extremely well. And who's doing it is the nitrifying bacteria are doing that. So the nitrifying bacteria can turn ammonium into nitrate and nitrite. And so plants can take that in. So to complete the cycle, there's yet even another kind of bacteria called denitrifying. Denitrifying bacteria will take in, also in the soil, nitrate. Now it'll take in nitrate and it'll break down the nitrate back into gaseous nitrogen. And so that then diffuses out of the soil. Remember when I was talking to you about the carbon cycle? I was saying that the bacteria produce carbon dioxide when they're respiring, and the carbon dioxide's coming out of the soil. There's nitrogen gas coming out of the soil. Nitrogen gas. How's that? Denitrifying bacteria are bringing it back into the atmosphere to complete the cycle. Okay, so here's the emphasis now. This nitrogen fixing bacteria are so critical because this is literally the bacteria that pull the gas out of the air. Now, the ammonifying bacteria are also critical because they're helping to break down detritus. But nitrogen fixing bacteria are literally pulling nitrogen gas out of the air, producing ammonium. They're really important. They're either free living in the soil. So in other words, soil on its own can actually become more fertile if you have a lot of nitrogen fixing bacteria. And then this is what's really, really cool. We've discovered that some plants actually have these nitrogen fixing bacteria living in the roots. So there's a symbiotic relationship between these nitrogen fixing bacteria and certain plants. It's in the class of plants called legumes. So things like alfalfa and clover and peanuts all have this bacteria. And again, these are not individual bacterias, but these are these root nodules, and there's like colonies of bacteria living there. So how about this? If you were to plant that crop, like if you were to plant alfalfa, if you will, in between when you're planting corn, the alfalfa, since it has a lot of nitrogen fixing bacteria, will draw a lot of nitrogen out of the air and will actually fertilize the soil for you naturally. Because if you wanted to put artificial soil, say you wanted to make your garden grow really efficiently, maybe you'll add some like Miracle Grow or something like that. That's a name brand, Miracle Grow. What does Miracle Grow have in it? It has nitrates, nitrites, and ammonium. And it also probably has a little bit of phosphorus too, and some potassium. But basically it has nitrogen in it. And it's like, well, if you don't want to add fertilizer, what you could do is these nitrogen fixing bacteria will help fertilize the soil as well. And so I mentioned symbiosis. It's mutual because what do the bacteria get? Well, they get sugar from the plant through photosynthesis. So it's pretty neat. This plant kind of comes along with its own bacteria to help fertilize the soil. Pretty awesome. And so here's a picture of an amino acid. And again, this is critical. There'll be a future discussion where I talk about the biochemistry of these molecules. But without that purple nitrogen coming from the soil, plants are not going to be able to make amino acids. And they're not going to be able to make DNA or RNA. And so it's rather critical. So this diagram summarizes the nitrogen cycle. So let me go over it kind of quickly because we've been talking about this. So let me just sort of trace the nitrogen this way. So nitrogen gas in the air can come in, and it can be picked up by nitrogen fixing bacteria if it happens to be on some, peas and beans are also legumes. And so those will produce ammonium as well. So nitrogen fixing either on plants or free living in the soil, nitrogen fixing, this is both nitrogen fixing, bacteria, nitrogen fixing, will produce ammonium. Now there's the ammonifying bacteria that I mentioned before. When everything dies, like here's some zucchini. Here's a zucchini blossom. It's very delicious if you ever had that to eat. So when everything dies, all the plants, animals, everything's dying, bacteria, the ammonifying bacteria are breaking it down into, guess what, ammonium. Then you have the nitrifying bacteria that are turning it into nitrates and nitrites, which are preferable to be assimilated by plants. So the nitrates, nitrites, and ammonium can go into plants. And what do they do with them? They make the amino acids which are needed to produce proteins. Okay? And then who's eating the protein? We are eating the protein. So how do we get nitrogen? Eating plants or eating animals. Depends on where we are in the trophic level. And then finally, denitrifying bacteria return the nitrates back into the atmosphere, and then you get the cycle going around. So the nitrogen cycle. Now, The phosphorus cycle, the element phosphorus, is very important as well. And you're like, well, why is that very important? It's important because it's also found in DNA. It's also found in a structure in the cell membrane in all of our cells called the phospholipid. It's also found in a very important energy molecule called adenosine triphosphate. And I can go further with that, but this is to say that it's very important. The thing about the phosphorus cycle is that it's a little bit more easygoing because there's no gas form of phosphorus. And if there's no gaseous form of phosphorus, it doesn't mean that it's going up into the air. Like, in other words, the soil isn't releasing it. The soil's not releasing it, it's not blowing all over the place, which means that it's more of a local cycle. So we have phosphorus, plants have phosphorus, animals have phosphorus, and so we're kind of local, especially a plant, a tree. So when the tree has it and dies, it's going to go right back into the soil, and then it's going to be picked up by the future plants. So it's kind of a local cycle. So as I was mentioning, organisms need phosphorus to survive. And it's a little bit easier going because there's no atmospheric compound. And as it turns out, it has a lot to do with the soil, because phosphorus is in the soil. Now, it's usually not limited in the soil. Now, of course, if you're growing lots of crops, they're going to need a lot of phosphorus. Where it is limited is in the water. And actually, that's a good thing. We had talked about this once before if you looked at a previous video. Sometimes too much phosphorus in the river will cause algae to grow. It's like, yeah, phosphorus. And then you don't want that because then it dies and it depletes the water. And so I was mentioning a chemical called adenosine triphosphate. And so this is what it is, adenosine triphosphate, ATP. There's the phosphate, there's the phosphate, and there's the phosphate. So in order to produce this molecule, you need to get phosphorus. Where do we get phosphorus? Well, we get it simply by eating. Animals get it from eating. Where do plants get it? The soil. And so this is a structure called a phospholipid. Looks a little bit like that. There's the phosphorus, and then there's these two tails that come off of this. This is a component of the cell membrane. So plants need to get phosphorus from the soil. And so here's some crops. They're growing. They're loving it. They're getting phosphorus from the soil. How'd the phosphorus get into the soil? Well, it's in rock as well. And then rock can be broken down through just weathering processes, which is physical. And then through rain and erosion, it can actually go into water. But basically, it's in the soil. And as it turns out, we could use it as fertilizer, although we want to not use too much of it. And then again, it helps plants to grow. And then where do animals get phosphorus? From eating the plants. And so when a plant and animal dies, it's simply broken down by bacteria. I won't go into the metabolism of that. I'll just keep it simple. The phosphorus is then broken down and it goes into the soil. So how about this? Phosphorus is in the soil, then it goes into the plants, and then it goes into the animal. And then when the animal dies, it goes back into the soil. So it's kind of a local cycle. But it's really important though. And again, just to emphasize this, you don't want to add, it's like humans have a tendency to be kind of greedy and sometimes selfish and short-sighted, But we add way too much phosphorus to our soil because we want our crops to grow. And then we're like, well, when it rains, again, all that runoff of phosphorus into the water and all the algae is thinking, oh, this is awesome. I love all this phosphorus. I will grow like this and form big algae blooms. And then what? Then the algae dies and the decomposers will consume all of the oxygen, and therefore the water is injured as a result of too much phosphorus in there. And so I just wanted to say that decomposition is really what we're talking about in the carbon cycle and what we're talking about in the nitrogen cycle and phosphorus. It's these decomposers. Again, the smallest microbes are of the most importance, and I think that is something that needs to be considered. And so when we're talking about how quickly does this chemical cycling take place, well, it depends on where you are. Like, for example, if you're here in the tropical rainforest and it's very moist and there's a lot of warm temperature, decomposition occurs very quickly. And so the nutrient cycling is boom, boom, boom. But if you're up here in the tundra, where it's like a freezer, it can be really, really slow. And so the recycling happens very, very slow. And so that's a factor when you're looking at biodiversity. If the nutrients aren't cycling very quickly, then it's not going to be able you're not going to be able to support a lot of vegetation and therefore not a lot of trophic levels. And so that's of consideration. And so finally, in this discussion of biogeochemical cycling, I have to mention one of the classic ecological experiments of all time in ecology, and it was conducted in the state of New Hampshire, in a region on a mountain slope called a watershed. Now, a watershed is basically like this. If you have, like, again, a valley like this, and so these are trees, and a watershed is this valley, and when it rains, the water runs down on both sides of the valley, and it basically goes down into like a river. This is what we mean by a watershed. And so, in terms of logging, like when you want to cut down some trees, it's very difficult to cut down just a couple of trees and then move over here and cut down a couple trees. It's much easier to sort of clear cut a big patch while you have the trucks there and hauling it all out. It's tough work. And so ecologists always wondered, what is the effect of the loss of vegetation, in other words, the forests, on nutrient cycling? And so what they did is they went out and they decided to do a long-term research study of this one little brook, this one little river in an area, and it was called the Hubbard Brook. So the Hubbard Brook experiment has been studied since 1963. So almost 50 years the data has been collected here. So what's interesting is that on one side over here, an area was clear cut. So the trees were removed. So take in all the stuff that we've been talking about and how vegetation, trees, take in nutrients from the soil. Okay, what's going to happen if you remove and clear cut an area? This is the Hubbard Brook area in the wintertime. You can see how it's white up here. It's snowing. Now when the water runs down the mountain, it's not just pure water. It's carrying a lot of nutrient like nitrogen, phosphorus, and what have you. And at the brook, this is the place where the water was sampled by the researchers. And then this is where the Hubbard Brook is in New Hampshire. And so check this out. We're looking at the levels of nitrogen, nitrate in the water at Hubbard Brook. Look at this here. Look how the numbers go from 1 all the way up to 80. It's so large it has to be broken up here. So, in other words, when the forest is intact, when you don't cut down the trees, the level of nitrogen in the water in the brook is relatively low, and it remains relatively low. Now, why is that? It's because the trees themselves are either holding on to the nitrogen or the root system is taking the nitrogen up, and when it rains, the nitrogen is remaining in the soil, the soil because of all the trees. If you cut down the forest like this, what's going to happen is there's no more vegetation, and so when it rains, all those nitrogen compounds are going to run off and go into the brook. So look at the levels of nitrogen in the deforested area. Now this is devastating because all that nitrogen that goes into the water, what's that going to do for the algae? It's going to love it. It's going to grow. It's going to deplete the oxygen, and it's going to basically kill everything down below. And so how do you like this? The river systems are destroyed. The fish are destroyed because of all the nutrient runoff. And so, as it turns out, this is a close-up of where the water was studied, where those numbers were picked up. And so preliminary studies confirm that there's an internal cycling in land ecosystems that conserve most of the mineral nutrients. This is what we're talking about, the biogeochemical cycles. And so that when you log an area, you can affect the nutrient content in the soil. And so loggers will say, well, I'm just going to, replant the trees, settle down. And it's like, well, you're not just going to replant the trees. Whoops. you're not just going to replant the trees, because the soil quality itself is going to be depleted, because a lot of it's going to run off into the Hubbard Brook. And so again, here's another look at how much nitrogen was released from the area once the forest was cut down. 60-fold increase, which is 6,000% in concentration in the stream. And so the river systems are possibly destroyed. And so this is a real important thing. So just to bring this close to home in California, we talk about the logging of redwood forests, and we're like, well, those are really precious. And well, it's not just the loss of the trees and the forest ecosystem, but the water system is also compromised as a result of this massive logging. So all these things need to be taken into consideration, because in an ecosystem, everything is related. It's the interaction of organisms and their environment, and the Hubbard Brook has shown us that. And so it's a really important study. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion of biogeochemical cycling, both water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. Thanks for watching.